The sea around Tsushima was silent. Not the gentle silence of dawn, not the calm that fishermen trusted with their lives, but heavy, suffocating quiet, the kind that presses against the chest and makes breathing feel wrong. The water lay flat and dark, reflecting the sky like polished stone, as if the sea itself was holding its breath. At first light in the year 1274, shapes appeared on the horizon, long low, countless. Fishermen froze where they stood. Some dropped their nets. Others fell to their knees. What they were seeing did not belong in these waters. These were not merchant vessels, not local warships. The silhouettes grew larger, clearer, resolving into hundreds of ships moving in eerie coordination, sails dark against the pale morning sky. This was not a raid. This was an empire. The invasion force sent by Kublai Khan, ruler of the Mongol Empire and emperor of the Yuan dynasty, had finally reached Japan. And Tsushima Island, small, isolated, lightly defended, had been chosen as the place where Japan would learn what resistance truly cost. Tsushima was not important militarily. It was important symbolically. It was close enough to Korea to reach easily, yet Japanese enough to bleed loudly. The Mongols understood fear better than any army in history. They knew that terror, once unleashed, traveled faster than soldiers ever could. The samurai stationed on Tsushima had no warning, no chance to prepare, no reinforcements waiting behind them. The island governor, So Sukakuni, gathered what forces he could. Fewer than 200 mounted warriors. They were men raised on stories of honor, lineage, and ritualized combat. They believed war began with formality, with names spoken aloud, with respect between enemies who recognized each other as warriors. They had never fought an enemy like this. As the Mongol ship struck the shore, the samurai rode forward, armor lacquered and polished, banners snapping in the sea wind. One by one, they announced their names, their clans, their ancestors, challenging invaders to single combat as tradition demanded. The Mongols did not answer. For a brief moment, there was only the sound of waves. Then the drums began, deep, rhythmic, relentless, and the sky turned black. Arrows rose in unison, hundreds at once, released with mechanical precision, not scattered shots, not individual aim, but synchronized death. The air screamed. Horses reared and collapsed as shafts punched through eyes and skulls. Samurai armor, designed to deflect blades, split apart as arrows drove through lacquer, leather, and flesh. Men fell before they could even raise their swords. There was no duel, no exchange, no honor, only impact. Then came something the Japanese had never witnessed. Explosions. Mongol soldiers hurled ceramic bombs packed with gunpowder and metal fragments into the charging samurai. These were early explosive weapons, imported from Chinese arsenals, unknown to Japanese warfare. When they detonated, bodies were torn apart, limbs vanished, armor shattered inward, turning protection into shrapnel. The sound was described later as thunder exploding inside the skull. Samurai chronicles speak of warriors freezing in place, not from fear, but from disbelief. This was not war as they understood it. This was destruction without ritual, death without meaning. The defensive line collapsed in minutes. Those who tried to flee were hunted down by Mongol cavalry. Those who surrendered were cut down where they knelt. There was no ransom, no mercy, no respect for rank. But the true horror did not end on the battlefield. It began after the fighting stopped. Mongol units moved through Tsushima's villages with methodical precision. Homes were broken open. Men were dragged outside and executed in front of their families. Some were beheaded cleanly. Others were tied to wooden frames and left to die slowly. Groups of villagers were bound together and pushed into the sea, their screams swallowed by the waves. Buddhist monks were slaughtered inside their temples. Sacred statues were smashed deliberately, not for gold, but for humiliation. This was psychological warfare, carried out with surgical cruelty. Women were separated from the rest. Here, the Japanese records grow quiet, not because nothing happened, but because what happened was too shameful, too horrifying, too painful to record plainly. The silence itself is evidence. From Mongol campaigns across China, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe, we know the pattern well. Women were taken as property, dragged aboard ships, used, traded, discarded. Some were killed once they were no longer useful. Others were thrown overboard to save space. Children were murdered openly because they slowed the march, because they consumed supplies, because terror demanded spectacle. Entire settlements vanished so completely that later tax records simply marked them as no longer existing. By nightfall, Tsushima Island was no longer a living place. It was a grave. Smoke rose from burned villages. Bodies floated offshore. The sea, once calm, now carried the dead back to the rocks in slow, accusing waves. The Mongols had spent less than 2 days on the island. That was all it took. Tsushima was not conquered. It was erased. And as the Mongol fleet pulled away, leaving behind ashes and silence, a message traveled ahead of them across the water, toward the Japanese mainland. This is what happens when you resist. If this was only the beginning, would you still stand and fight? The survivors who escaped Tsushima did not arrive as men returning from battle. They arrived broken, voices hoarse from screaming, bodies shaking, eyes unfocused, as if part of them had been left behind on the island with the dead. They spoke of thunder that came from the hands of soldiers, of arrows that fell like rain without warning, of villages erased in hours, of women dragged away toward the sea, never to be seen again. Many officials on the mainland refused to believe them. Japan had fought wars before. Bandits, rival clans, pirates. Violence was not new, but what these men described did not fit any known shape of war. Exploding weapons, armies that ignored rank, soldiers who killed civilians deliberately and without hesitation. Some dismissed the survivors as cowards trying to justify defeat. Then the Mongols reached Iki Island. Iki was small, poorly defended, much like Tsushima, and what happened there confirmed every nightmare the survivors had spoken aloud. The Mongol landing was fast and deliberate. Archers advanced first, firing in formation. Infantry followed, shields locked. Samurai resistance collapsed almost immediately. The same patterns repeated. No duels, no mercy, no pause. Villages burned whether they resisted or not. Men were executed publicly. Heads were taken not as trophies of honor, but as instruments of fear. Japanese chronicles described lines of severed heads placed along paths and beaches, so that anyone approaching would see them before seeing a single living Mongol soldier. Women were gathered again, separated again, taken again, and again. The records grow thin, not because historians did not know, but because they could not bring themselves to write it plainly. The Mongols were not improvising. This was doctrine, under the rule of Kublai Khan. The Mongol Empire had perfected a strategy that crushed resistance before it could fully form. Terror was not a side effect of conquest. It was the weapon. By the time the invasion fleet turned toward Hakata Bay on the Japanese mainland, the psychological war had already been won. Or so the Mongols believed. Panic spread across Kyushu. Samurai from different clans gathered along the coast, but they were no longer confident warriors riding toward glory. They were men trying to hold back a nightmare they barely understood. Rituals were abandoned, formal challenges forgotten. There were no names shouted now, only silence and clenched teeth. Makeshift defenses were thrown up along the shoreline, wooden barricades, earthen walls, anything that might slow the enemy. When the Mongol ships arrived, they did not rush blindly into battle. They anchored offshore. They assessed. They waited. Then they attacked. Arrows poured from ships and shore simultaneously. Infantry advanced behind shields, moving as a single body. Korean and Chinese conscripts, pressed into Mongol service, were pushed to the front, absorbing losses while elite troops followed behind. This was warfare without sentiment. Captured samurai were dragged forward and executed where Japanese defenders could see them clearly. Some were beheaded. Others were stabbed repeatedly until they stopped moving. According to several accounts, a number of prisoners had their hands cut off before being killed. Their mutilated bodies sent back toward Japanese lines as a warning of what surrender meant. Other sources describe mass drownings. Groups of prisoners were tied together, loaded onto small boats, and taken just offshore, close enough that screams could still be heard. Then they were pushed into the water, armor dragging them down as waves closed overhead. The message was unmistakable. There would be no mercy. There would be no prisoners. There would only be submission or death. As night fell, Japanese defenders expected fighting to slow. Traditionally, battles ended at sunset. Darkness was for rest, prayer, preparation. The Mongols attacked anyway. Small boats detached from the fleet under cover of darkness. They slid onto the shore, silently. Samurai sleeping in camps were stabbed before they could wake. Tents were slashed open. Fires were set deliberately, not to illuminate the battlefield, but to create confusion and panic. One Japanese chronicle describes a warrior waking to a wet sound beside him, only to realize his companion's throat was being cut inches away. Another describes men running blindly into the dark, colliding with enemies they never saw until steel entered their bodies. Fear spread faster than fire. And yet, despite the terror, despite the overwhelming brutality, the Mongol advance slowed. Japanese resistance, hardened by desperation, began to adapt. Samurai fought in groups. They ambushed. They struck supply lines. They learned quickly because they had no choice. Mongol forces, used to rapid collapse from terror alone, found themselves stalled along the coast. Then the sky changed. Clouds rolled in heavy and fast. Winds rose. Waves began to churn violently. What started as rough weather became something far worse. A storm slammed into the Mongol fleet. Ships collided with one another in the dark. Anchors snapped. Masts shattered. Soldiers in heavy armor were dragged into the sea, sinking immediately, unable to swim. The same ocean that had carried terror to Japan now turned against it. Japanese defenders watched from shore as ships broke apart. They heard screams carried by the wind, voices crying out in languages they did not understand, begging gods that did not answer. Thousands drowned. The sea swallowed bodies and wreckage alike. Armor, weapons, and corpses washed back onto the shore for days afterward, tangled together in grotesque knots. By morning, the invasion force was crippled. The Mongols withdrew. Japan survived. But survival came at a cost that could not be undone. Tsushima and Iki were gone. Entire families erased. Traditions shattered. The old idea of war, of honor and restraint, lay buried beneath the waves alongside the dead. The first Mongol invasion had failed, but it had taught Japan a lesson written in blood. The world had changed, and mercy would never be the same again. 7 years passed. 7 years of rebuilding walls, sharpening blades, and telling stories that parents hoped their children would never fully understand. 7 years of silence broken only by nightmares. Men waking in the dark, smelling smoke that was no longer there, hearing waves that sounded too much like screaming. Japan told itself the danger had passed. The Mongols had been defeated by the storm. The gods had intervened. The sea itself had chosen a side. But empires do not forget humiliation. Across the water, plans were already being made. Bigger plans, colder plans, plans that would not rely on chance or weather or mercy. In 1281, the Mongols returned. This time, they did not come as a single force. They came as two massive fleets, one from Korea, one from southern China, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers. It was one of the largest naval invasion forces the medieval world had ever seen. The ships were heavier, the soldiers more experienced, the commanders more cautious. And once again, Tsushima lay in their path. The island had been rebuilt, but it was no longer innocent. The people remembered. They had buried too many bodies to forget. Defensive positions were prepared. Lookouts scanned the horizon constantly. There were no illusions left. Only fear sharpened into resolve. When the Mongol ships appeared again, there was no disbelief this time, only dread. The landings were brutal from the first hour. Mongol troops poured ashore under covering fire, arrows slamming into defensive positions without pause. Japanese defenders responded immediately, not with formal challenges, not with ritual, but with ambushes, traps, and coordinated strikes. This was not the old samurai warfare. This was survival. Japanese fighters attacked at night, slipping into Mongol camps, setting ships ablaze, cutting down soldiers in their sleep. They targeted commanders. They poisoned wells. They struck supply lines wherever possible. Captured Mongols were not spared. Many were executed immediately. Heads were taken and displayed. Bodies were mutilated and left where others would find them. Japan had learned the lesson Tsushima taught the first time. Terror could be answered only with terror. The Mongols responded in kind and then escalated. Villages suspected of aiding defenders were destroyed even if no resistance was found. Civilians were rounded up and executed publicly to discourage cooperation. Prisoners were drowned in groups, tied together and pushed into the sea within sight of shore. Later chronicles, written years after the fact, hint at darker acts aboard the invasion ships. The language is cautious, indirect, filled with euphemism, but the meaning is clear enough. Women taken during raids were treated as spoils of war. Some were forced into servitude. Others were killed once they became a burden. Exact numbers are impossible to verify. What matters is the pattern. This was not chaos. It was consistency. Despite the scale of the invasion, the Mongols did not achieve the rapid collapse they expected. Japanese defenses held longer. Coastal fortifications slowed advances. Constant raids exhausted the invaders. Supplies dwindled. Coordination between the two Mongol fleets faltered. And then, once again, the sky darkened. The wind rose slowly at first, almost deceptively. Waves grew rougher. Anchors strained. Commanders hesitated, whether to press forward or retreat. They waited too long. The storm that followed was worse than the first. Typhoon winds slammed into the anchored fleets with overwhelming force. Ships smashed into one another, hulls cracking like bones. Masts snapped. Sails tore free and vanished into the dark. Soldiers in armor were thrown into the sea, sinking instantly, dragged down by the very protection meant to keep them alive. Men screamed. Orders were lost in the wind. Fires spread as lanterns tipped and spilled across wooden decks, already breaking apart. The sea became a weapon. By dawn, the invasion was in ruins. Thousands of bodies floated among wreckage. Broken ships washed ashore, carrying the dead with them. Survivors clung to debris, crawling toward land where Japanese fighters waited, not to offer aid, but to finish what the storm had begun. Few were spared. Some were enslaved. Some were executed immediately. Others were killed slowly, as warnings, as vengeance, as release. The beaches of Tsushima filled with corpses again. The smell lingered for months. Bones surfaced long after the waves had carried flesh away. The Mongols never returned. The invasion was over. Japan survived, but not unchanged. The idea of honorable war died on those shores. Ritual combat vanished. Mercy became conditional. The samurai class hardened, reshaping itself around preparedness and discipline rather than ceremony. And Tsushima, scarred, haunted, remembered, stood as proof of what happens when empire meets resistance, and neither side is willing to bend. History would later call it divine intervention, but those who lived through it knew the truth. There was nothing holy about what happened here. Only blood, only fear, only the long shadow of violence stretching across generations. When the sea finally went quiet again, it was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of exhaustion. Wreckage littered the coast. Splintered hulls, snapped masts, torn sails tangled with bodies. Armor washed ashore in twisted piles, still filled with the men who had worn it. For weeks, the tide returned the dead in waves, laying them gently on the sand as if refusing to let anyone forget what had happened here. The people of Tsushima did not celebrate. There were no parades, no songs of victory, no sense of triumph, only counting the missing, counting the burned homes, counting the graves, many of them empty, because there was nothing left to bury. Entire family lines had ended without record. Villages that had existed for generations were gone so completely that even their names faded from memory. What the Mongols had begun with blades and fire, the sea had finished with indifference. In later years, storytellers would speak of the kamikaze, the divine wind sent by the gods to save Japan. It was comforting to believe that a higher power had intervened, that there was meaning in the chaos, that the suffering had been part of a plan. But those who survived Tsushima knew better. They had seen what men did to other men when rules vanished. They had seen women taken, children drowned, monks slaughtered in places meant for prayer. They had seen honor break under the weight of survival. There was nothing divine about the screams carried away by the storm. What followed was not relief, but transformation. Japan changed quietly, deliberately, and forever. Stone walls rose along the coast where none had stood before. Samurai trained not for ritualized duels, but for coordinated defense. Night fighting became common. Ambush replaced ceremony. The old belief that war could be controlled by etiquette died on the shores of Tsushima. Mercy became conditional. Suspicion became instinct. And the stories told to children changed. They were no longer stories of glorious single combat beneath open skies. They were warnings. Lessons carved from blood. Reminders that the world beyond the sea was vast, cruel, and patient. The Mongol Empire, too, learned something. It had conquered much of the known world through terror and speed. But Japan showed that fear did not always produce submission. Sometimes it produced resistance hardened into something unbreakable. The cost was staggering. Tens of thousands dead. Civilian lives erased without record. Trauma passed silently from generation to generation. History books would later compress it into dates and outcomes. 2 invasions. 2 storms. 1 nation saved. But that version leaves too much out. It leaves out the women whose names were never written down. It leaves out the children who disappeared into the sea. It leaves out the villagers who survived only to spend the rest of their lives waking in the night, listening for drums that were no longer there. Tsushima was not a miracle. It was a warning. A warning about what happens when empire meets identity, when terror becomes policy, and when survival demands that humanity be set aside. And that warning still echoes, because every era tells itself it is more civilized than the last. Every generation believes it has outgrown the brutal instincts of history. Yet the patterns repeat, different banners, different weapons, same silence after the screaming stops. If you listen closely, Tsushima is still speaking. It tells us that honor is fragile, that mercy is expensive, and that war, once unleashed, does not care who deserves to suffer. If you want more stories they never taught you in school, stories buried beneath myth and victory, subscribe for more hidden horrors of the past, because history is not finished with us yet, and it is always watching.